The story, based on true events, tells about Richard Wershey Jr., who became an FBI informant at the age of 14 and by 17 had already turned into one of the biggest drug dealers in the city. In 1984, a father and son are bargaining with a gun seller trying to buy AK-47 rifles cheaper. Richard Wershey Sr. outsmarts the seller, threatening him with losing his license since he was about to sell a machine gun to a 14-year-old kid. The Wershey family lives in Detroit. The city has fallen into decline, but Richard has no intention of leaving. He dreams of opening a chain of video stores and making a fortune. Richard spots a car near his house belonging to a local black hustler. A perfect time to use the newly bought rifle to threaten his daughter's boyfriend. Dawn is already high. Her father tells her to get ready, they are going to a cafe for ice cream. But Dawn is more interested in hanging out with Tyrone. She runs after his car wearing only her underwear. Just then, her grandparents arrive, and they too get involved in the family quarrel. In the basement, Richard makes silencers for the guns they bought. The next morning, Dawn wakes her brother and tells him she's leaving, moving in with Tyrone, because in her opinion, living under the same roof with their father is simply unbearable. White people live in the suburbs of Detroit, while the city center is populated by poor African Americans. Richard Jr. is a white outsider here. He goes to a gangster hideout and offers the criminals to buy rifles and silencers for them. The silencers, in fact, significantly increase the price of the weapons. Rudolph is shocked by the kid's audacity. He just showed up, risking his white ass. He invites Ricky to come over to the skating rink that evening. He's the only white guy among the black crew. Ricky starts eyeing the girl of the local boss, Johnny Curry, who happens to be the mayor of Detroit's niece. Her bodyguards are local cops. Everyone here is connected. One morning, FBI agents burst into the Wershey house. They accused Richard of the illegal manufacturing, possession, and sale of firearms, the very same silencers he had made. They wanted the man to turn in his buyers, but Richard refused to make a deal. Then Agent Snyder called Ricky over and showed him photos of gangsters, but he only pointed to those who had already been killed. As for the boss, Johnny Curry, Ricky, of course, didn't turn him in. Together with the thugs, Ricky amused himself by shooting rats with a pistol. One of them got splattered with blood. The feds realized they could put pressure on Ricky, and one evening they invited him to sit in their car. Inside was Detective Jackson from the Narcotics Division. The streets were overrun with drug dealers, and the boy had seen firsthand, through his sister's example, what drug use led to. But these talks didn't work on Ricky. Then they showed him a photo of a corpse with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, from the same gun his father had once bought at a gun show. So the fate of Richard Sr. was now in the hands of his son. Ricky agreed to cooperate. They took him to a drug spot to make a buy. After completing the task, Ricky went home with a huge duck he had found in a dumpster. For his work, he received $300. Johnny Curry was marrying the mayor's niece, so he bought suits for his brothers, and for Ricky too, since Ricky was best friends with one of them. The celebration was held at the mayor's residence. Ricky seemed to be the only white guy among all the guests, but later he noticed a man Johnny was talking to. That was Arderick, the biggest supplier in town. Ricky wandered through the mansion, dreaming of one day becoming rich. After the banquet, the youngsters went for a drive around the city. Ricky saw Brenda and invited her on a date. The girl thought he had already been killed. Usually when someone stops showing up at school, it means they've either been killed or locked up. Ricky liked Brenda, and the girl couldn't resist. She gave herself to him right there in the parking lot. Jackson gave Ricky a new assignment, to sell drugs on the street. The boy didn't like the idea at all, but he could keep all the profit for himself, $4 grand in total. That kind of offer was too good for a teenager to refuse. Soon, he became one of the crew. A shoebox full of money overflowed to the top. The year 1985 arrived. Richard Sr. kept dealing in weapons. One day he saw his son sitting in a car with some cops. The man immediately searched his son's room and found a box containing $10,000. Richard lashed out at his son. He shouldn't have made any deals, and he didn't care that the boy only wanted to protect him. That night, Ricky grabbed his duck and drove his grandfather's car to a cafe. It was a gift for his sister. Dawn looked worse than ever. Her brother begged her to come home and leave Tyrone. He was destroying her. Ricky forgot the car keys inside and it got stolen. The brother and sister ran outside and shot at it with 2 guns, but the thief managed to get away. However, they were immediately arrested. Possession of weapons, driving without a license, and attempted murder. That was the list of charges against the boy. but the FBI promised to get him acquitted in court. Grandpa was furious with Ricky. He had lost his car. The kid drove to Johnny's garage. The gangsters started questioning him about what he told the cops. They didn't understand why he had been released so quickly. And Johnny didn't like that Ricky was selling on his turf. If Ricky had even a single gram on him, he was forbidden from approaching Johnny or anyone close to him. Leon Lucas owed Johnny a ton of money, but for now, he managed to get a delay. The criminal bought himself time by inviting the gangsters to a boxing match in Las Vegas. That's how Ricky learned what a truly luxurious life looked like. It was hard for him to keep his eyes off Kathy, Johnny's wife. She had caught his attention from the very first moment he saw her. When the time for the fight came, Johnny found out that no VIP seats had been reserved for them and that all the tickets were already sold out. So the gangsters had to watch the boxing match on TV in a bar. After that, Johnny went to a party hosted by Art Derrick. There, a gangster who had seen how Johnny wasn't let into the fight started mocking him. Johnny wouldn't tolerate it. He grabbed a bottle of champagne and beat the man half to death with it. Johnny held a grudge against Leon Lucas, who had dared to humiliate him like that, and sent 2 hitmen to his house. They sprayed bullets into the home while Leon's 2 young sons were inside. One of the boys didn't survive. The shooting was done with modified AK-47 rifles. Ricky came home to his father. Richard teased his son, who wore a huge gold Star of David around his neck even though he wasn't Jewish. The father asked Ricky to go back to school. Soon he'd be in so deep that he wouldn't be able to get out. A corrupt cop informed Johnny that the feds had an informant, so he needed to check his people. The boss knew there was no way to cover up the killing of a child. Someone from their crew would definitely take the fall, and he decided it might as well be someone from another gang. Everyone in the neighborhood grew tense. Ricky now avoided contact with the feds. For the time being, he lived with his grandparents. Richard, just in case, decided to get rid of all the automatic rifles he had. Ricky confessed to his father that he planned to go back to school. He went into the house to look at his father's fish. Then one of Johnny Curry's henchmen showed up. He apologized, pulled out a gun, and shot Ricky in the stomach. The boy was taken to the hospital under a false name. Doctors fought for his life. Richard blamed the feds for everything and was determined to take revenge on the crime boss. He waited for Johnny near his garage, but too many people showed up with the gangster, and Richard didn't dare to pull the trigger. Agent Snyder came to see Ricky, hoping to find out who shot him. The boy refused to talk, but they already knew who was behind the attempt. Besides, they had raided one of the drug spots, and the dealers had given up Johnny. A SWAT team stormed Johnny's house and arrested him along with the rest of his crew. Ricky was released from the hospital. He hoped to see his sister at home. Tyrone had already dumped her, but she was still wandering somewhere. Ricky wondered how he could go back to school with a catheter, but after the shooting, they wouldn't let him back anyway. He was considered a danger to the other students. Ricky still hadn't fully recovered. A 10-year-old kid came up to him, saying his sister had a baby from Ricky, and now he had to act like a man and take responsibility. Ricky went to see Brenda to look at his daughter, who was now a month and a half old. He took the baby in his arms, and at that moment, Richard walked in. The grandfather was happier about the child than his son was. Unlike his father, Ricky wasn't an optimist. He hinted that his dad should start selling drugs instead of weapons. That way they could get rich fast and change their lives for the better. But Richard had principles. He wasn't going to poison people in the streets. The man got distracted while driving, and he and his son nearly crashed into another car. Ricky kept trying to convince his father that Dawn wasn't coming back because they were broke. Now he was a father himself, and he needed money too. Soon Ricky dropped by Art Derrick's place and made a deal with him for drug supplies. After Johnny's downfall, he inherited a wide client base. One night, he and his father went to a crack house to take Dawn home. Richard picked up his daughter. She started screaming and fighting back, but eventually, too weak to resist, she gave up. Now the girl had to go through withdrawal. Richard locked her in a room. Ricky really did start making a lot of money, and he began showering Brenda with food and gifts. At 16, the kid had become a new authority figure, while Kathy was left without a husband. They started glancing at each other more and more. Richard did everything he could to help his daughter recover, and finally, Dawn began to get better. Dawn had turned into a homebody. Richard gathered his family to celebrate the opening of his first video store. One day, Ricky worked up the courage to approach Kathy at a bar. That same night, he ended up in her apartment and found out that Johnny had been sentenced to 20 years, which meant he could now take over Johnny's business and his woman as well. Richard finally felt happy. Both of his children were living under his roof, and they all needed to appreciate that. The man asked his son not to be greedy and not to take more than they needed. Otherwise, everything could easily fall apart. But it was already too late. The next morning, a police squad stormed the house and arrested both father and son. Jackson called the kid a complete idiot if he truly thought he could get away with it. The newspapers nicknamed Ricky the Cocaine Baron. In his room, inside a box, they found 8 kilograms of drugs. Richard was furious. After all, it was the feds who had pushed his son to sell drugs on the streets. But who would believe that a 15-year-old boy had been working for the Federal Bureau? The family met with FBI agents at a motel, but they refused to admit that they had made the kid sell drugs. They claimed he had done it on his own, voluntarily. Now, Ricky was facing a life sentence. But he could be released if he helped the feds plant an undercover agent inside an organization. The feds wanted to get close to the mayor, and they planned to do it through his niece Kathy, with whom Ricky had become close. Richard persuaded his son to agree. The man asked to have the deal put in writing, but the agents refused and told him to trust their word. Ricky went to Kathy and asked her to have the mayor's people help escort a large shipment of drugs. After the operation, 11 police officers and several of the mayor's close friends were arrested. On TV, they openly said the bust had been made possible thanks to Ricky Wersch's help. Richard reassured his family, saying that they had an agreement with the feds, and everything would be settled quietly. The trial for Ricky's case came to an end. The jury delivered its verdict. Richard Wershe Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Grandpa was outraged. The boy was only 17. They had taken his life away. Ricky was taken to his new home. 1 hour of solitary yard time a day, the rest of the time locked in his cell. Richard waited outside the FBI building to confront Agent Snyder, but she avoided him. The woman said no one had promised them anything. The Bureau had requested leniency, but the court refused, and that was that. Richard found another agent. That man explained that since they hadn't managed to arrest the mayor, they had to go after his son instead. Don visited Ricky with his daughter. Grandpa had fallen ill after the trial. He might not recover. Ricky, with tears in his eyes, asked his sister to show the little girl his photos more often. Richard took the phone and tried to comfort his son, saying he had spoken to the agents and maybe Ricky would be out in 6 years. But Ricky was desperate. This wasn't life. It was death. Richard had always believed his son's life would be better than his own, but he was the one who had ruined it. The man asked for forgiveness and told Ricky that the family would always stand by him, but the boy simply hung up the phone. Ricky served his sentence starting in 1988 until he was granted parole in 2017. 29 years later, the longest prison sentence in Michigan's history for a nonviolent crime. His father didn't live to see the day. He passed away just 3 years before Ricky's release. Johnny Curry and his gang members had long been free. All the corrupt cops managed to escape punishment. Throughout the years, Ricky kept in touch with his daughter. She was happy, married, and had 2 sons of her own. That's where the movie ends.